Welcome to the Story Talks Back. Almost everything that we remember, think about, or imagine is a story. Stories entertain us, inform us, and even define us. They have upsides, and they have downsides. This podcast explores the power of story in every aspect of our lives. I'm Dave Stanton. Thank you for joining us. T. Coraghessan Boyle is the author of 28 books of fiction, including Descent of Man, Water Music, World's End, which won the Faulkner Prize, The Road to Wellville, Drop City, Talk Talk, The Women, TC Boyle Stories, The Relive Box, and Outside Looking In. His work has been translated into more than 24 languages, and his fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, The Atlantic Monthly, The Paris Review, McSweeney's, and many other publications. Since 1978, he has been a member of the English department at the University of Southern California, where he is a distinguished professor of English. He currently lives near Santa Barbara with his wife and 3 children. Okay, cool. Well, Tom, it's great to welcome you to the Story Talks Back. I really appreciate your time. And
My pleasure, David. It's good to see you.
Glad to have you. So we always start out the interviews by talking about stories in your childhood and your formative years. So I was wondering if you can think of any ways that, stories or storytellers really played a part in your growing up.
More in my late childhood and early teen years when I developed my group of core friends who are still my friends to this day. I grew up in northern Westchester near Peekskill, and I sort of gravitated toward all the kids who were kind of wise guys and disaffected, but very bright. And we had a kind of competition, we still do, as to wit. I mean, our highest icon in life was the wittiest person and the wittiest thing, and our conversations would revolve around constantly trying to outdo each other and be funnier and funnier and funnier. So that involved storytelling, of course, and those sessions would become stories in themselves. You may notice that my first book, Water Music, is dedicated to the members of the Raconteurs Club. And that didn't actually exist, but that's what I called our little circle of storytellers, bullshitters, basically.
So can you remember like what those stories were like?
No, entirely spontaneous, and we were just teen guys, hoping to get laid and have a life like everybody else and doing destructive and crazy things like everybody else and encouraging each other. And the stories would be spontaneous in the moment and routines, of course. You develop routines, which I've always loved. A shtick. I've always loved the shtick. I mean, look at my Twitter today. It's insistently shtick oriented.
What about even earlier though? Like when you were, wow, that's a nice big coffee.
David, I don't know about it in New York, but California law prohibits me specifically from drinking coffee because coffee so fuels me that I become a mass murderer. It's just tea.
Got it. Okay.
I burn with a high flame inside, and I don't need any more stimulation. The tea is for getting me through work each day and sparking me a little bit. And what is that? Coffee?
Iced coffee.
Ah, well, good. Summer's coming on.
Right. But going back even a little further, I mean, do you remember anything about stories from your childhood?
Well, of course. I was a hyperactive kid. We didn't have such things as ADD in those days, but I must have driven my parents insane, uh, bouncing off the walls. And so I didn't really do very well in the beginning of school. So my mother is the one who taught me to read quite patiently. night after night. Uh, so her voice is the voice I always hear, and this is why I love to give public readings, because I want to project that voice, and that first voice that we all hear when we're learning to read,
Mm.
parents. I remember our local paper, the Peekskill Evening Star, in the month before Christmas, each day would have a story that would serialize and culminate on Christmas, and it had a little illustration, and that fascinated me. And she would read me that. A little later on, I began to read on my own, and I was attracted to animal stories, which is no surprise for those who know my work. Uh, and our school was directly across the street, and it had a little library. And I began to take books out of the library, and wonderful stories about animals. Also, at that time, of course, there were comic books. And I never really cared for the superheroes, and still don't. In fact, I can't go to the movies in the summertime because it's nothing but superheroes. Um, um, I did love the story-oriented ones, like Classics Illustrated. My first experience of you know, the Odyssey and things like that, and the Donald Duck comic books. And later in my life, I met Herb Trimpe, the guy who invented the Hulk, or drew the Hulk. I don't know if
Huh.
you drew the Hulk. And we talked about comics, and I said, "Well, Herb, I'm sorry. I mean, I never read that stuff." And he said, "What did you read?" I said, "Well, Donald Duck." And he said, "Well, they were famous for their stories, storytelling."
Mm.
So there was all that going on in my young days.
You talked about your mother's voice and how, that was a real early embodiment of story for you. I mean, is telling your stories out loud, is that still really important to you? Is that something you do as you write?
Yes, yes. The beat and language of the story is all important to me. Every sentence and the beauty of the sentence is what is the primary driver for my writing. Aside from, of course, trying to tell a story, but you must tell it in a very, very beautiful way. And this is what I try to do. I always listen to music. I've never written anything without music playing.
Hmm.
And if I've progressed on something in a given day, I will ask my wife to listen to it and read it aloud to her, because it gives me a sense of the beat. And it's ironic in that I'm quite popular in German translation, for instance, and in French as well. Uh, and I'm so happy about that. And yet, especially the French, are not getting the original. They're not getting the beat of the original.
Huh.
In German, it's different because so many of the Germans read English, and many of them will read both the German and the English edition. Great. I wish I could do that. But the original and the way it plays is so important to me, which, by the way, is why I love to listen to my heroes read. Uh, there are tapes of both Cheever and Updike reading their stories aloud. Neither one is a very good reader. Cheever is awful. He doesn't pause for the jokes or the laughter or anything else. He just plows ahead. Updike is a little better, but also not a really great performer.
Huh.
But I want to hear their voice and their inflection, and I'm fascinated by this.
Right. Who who would you say is a really good vocal storyteller that you've heard or who inspired you?
Hmm. I don't know. I can't say right now. Oh, one of the greatest is Robert Coover, one of my early heroes. If
Uh-huh.
you've had a chance to hear Bob, go and hear him. He's astonishing. He gets into his role. Stanley Elkin. Stanley Elkin was the greatest. He was. He would just. He would. Uh, I've said this before. Actually, I've written about it. We students learned not to sit within the first 4 or 5 rows because of the flying spittle as Stanley worked himself into this actor's rage. But yeah, he really lived the stories, and it's odd that writers in our time have been asked to perform and be performers because, of course, the largest part of a writer is this introverted side, lock away, and the story exists on the page, and there's no reason whatsoever for us to be there interpreting it orally for anybody.
Right.
But certain of us used to sing in a rock and roll band, and we want to be on stage, and we want to be, and knock the audiences dead. Um, my One of my best moments in doing this over all these years is, you know me very well, David. You know, in the beginning, I was much more interested in design and idea than in character, and I was much more interested in the absurd kind of stories and metafiction and so on. But under the influence of people like Ray Carver, who became a good friend, and to a degree Cheever and others over the years, I expanded my range. And I also, as you see, look in my collected stories, you'll see that, I often will write also a straightforward, realistic, dramatic story. And so I wrote a story called Chicxulub, I guess, in the early 90s, maybe. I don't remember exactly. And it's a very grueling first person narrative of a father and mother. They're getting ready to go to bed, and their teenage daughter is out, and they get a phone call that she has been hit by a car and is in the hospital, and they have to go and deal with that. This story, this story is a killer. It is so grim and tense, And I read it as the father in the first person. And one of the first times I read it was at the Miami Book Fair before it became such a huge thing. And it was a small venue, and there were only maybe 30 people in a small room. And about midway through, one of those 30 people began to sob. And it was horrifying, absolutely horrifying. Everybody is aware of it. Everybody's horrified. I'm horrified. I wanted to stop and say, it's only fiction. But it happened to her, and here she was sobbing. Even better, as I progressed as an actor, um, I've read this story many times to many audiences, including a huge audience in arts and lectures in San Francisco, 1,500 people, whatever it is, in the dark auditorium. I can't see them. They're there. You can feel them. And there's a point in that story at which no one moved or breathed. You go to any concert, anything, there's people shuffle their chair, they sneeze, they whatever, nothing. It's just me looking into the blackness, David, giving them this horrific thing. And I felt what actors must feel. Oh man, did I have them. The power of that was so great. And that's something that you don't get when you're delivered on the page. Maybe especially in this age of social media, I'm in contact with the fans and we talk about it and so on. But it's not the same thing. It's not knowing what the effect is. So performing is a whole different thing for me, and I really enjoy it. And it goes back to what you're talking about here, the power of storytelling, remembering that originally we had rhyming poetry and songs in order so that we could remember the history of our tribe and the stories that we tell and tell them aloud around the
Used
campfire while
it
roasting
used
wildebeest.
in the days before TV
Yeah. Wow.
or even radio.
Yeah. Yeah. We talk about Dickens, and he's my role model as far as having a writer's life. And not only did he sell books, but he went on tour, and he was the Rolling Stones and the movie theater and everything else rolled into one. My God. He was the only show in town, and he milked it.
You also came from an area, a part of New York State that is really rich in stories, and you've
Yes.
mined that in World's End. I mean, have you thought any more about how living in that particular geography maybe may help to make you a storyteller?
I don't know about that. I think it was more what we talked about earlier. I think most of my friends I grew up with are Jewish, and the Jewish sense of humor is like the Irish sense of humor, I think, to a degree, in that we know everything is fucked, and now we're going to tell jokes about it. I think that more than anything else. However, regional things are interesting. In writing World's End, that was my homage to the storytelling of the Hudson Valley and the Dutch times and the history of it, and particularly of Washington Irving, who inspired that book. Um, when I was a student at Iowa, uh, and I'd finished my PhD, I was a finalist for a professorship assistant professorship at three different universities. Uh, One, which I was really keen on because I was then in the Midwest, was the University of Minnesota, a place I love. Another was in Salt Lake City, and the other was in LA, in USC. As it turned out, USC offered me the job, and I've made my life on the West Coast. So I'm sort of a regional California writer at this point. I would never have written the Tortilla Curtain, for instance, had I gone to Minnesota. Maybe I would have written about the prejudice against the Swedes when they came over as immigrants, but it's not the same thing. So my or the Channel Islands books that I've written and all of this stuff. So many of the books are set in California. The Drop City, until they go to Alaska, is California. So yeah, the regional thing is is mysterious and powerful for me. I'm not a globetrotter, except of course for the eternal uh, book tours. Uh, I like to be located in a place. It's important to me to have a life in a village as where I live now. It grounds me in a way. Uh, and yes, you could look at all the stories I've written, novels, and they're set all over the world. They're set everywhere. Okay, great. But basically, California has spoken to me these last years, as New York had spoken to me before. In fact, if you look at the first couple of books of stories, um, stories that could be set anywhere. There's a guy in an apartment that he's talking, they were usually set in New York. No, they're usually set in LA, it's just the way it is.
I mean, do you remember the point at which you started to feel or somebody encouraged you to think that you could be a writer, that you could really make a living as a storyteller?
I didn't think in terms of making a living. Don't forget, David, I am a hippie. And hippies, one of my best friends, by the way, is still in New York, is a glassblower. He still has hair down his back, and he's a glassblower.
I think I met him once. Yeah.
You may have met him. Uh, John Gilby. He's become quite famous and wealthy as a result of it. But who knew? We didn't do it because we were going to make money. We didn't care about that. That's what the bourgeoisie did. We didn't care about that. We cared about art and music, literature, and art. That's it. That's all we cared about. So um, it's been a happy, happy, happy accident that I found what I could do and what I love to do, and that I have been rewarded for it to the degree at which I could at least uh, pay my bills and raise my children. Uh, I'm delighted. I'm absolutely delighted by that. If you ask me about my origins as a writer, one of the reasons that I've loved to teach creative writing and did it for all those years is to give back what was given to me. I've had great mentors, and uh, to go to a liberal arts school and find out what you can do is a kind of miracle. So I went to SUNY Potsdam, State University of New York at Potsdam, as an undergrad because it was the music school. I wanted to be a musician. And when I got there, I flunked my audition. I could play the living hell out of my instrument, which was the saxophone. I could play it upside down. I could sight transpose. I could do anything. But I really didn't have a feel rhythmically for the music they expected us to play, classical music. Um, I found myself then in Potsdam at a liberal arts college having to declare a major. And so I said history. I always loved history, as you can see from my novels. And in the second year, I went into a class of the American short story and discovered Flannery O'Connor. And I said, okay, I'm going to be a double major, history and English. And in the third year, I blundered into a creative writing classroom with Krishna Vad. And that's when I discovered my métier, and I've burned with it ever since. I write about it humorously, and you can find it on my website. This uh, little essay called This Monkey, My Back, in which I talk about this compulsion to write and create art, which is like using heroin, something I also know something about. You get this rush when you inject it, and you have this rush when you finish a story. It's the satisfaction and it just bursts through your body, and it's so great. But as with any addiction, it soon wears off, and you have to do it again and again and again. It's a compulsion. I've often described this writing as an obsessive compulsive disorder, but happily, it gives me something to do all day long. And I've never
I
found,
was wondering,
David, I
what's
should say,
that?
I've never found the end of it yet. So, I have my PhD, I'm a professor, etc. And yes, I talk like this with the press. I talk about politics, the environment, but I don't want to give speeches. I don't want to write essays. I just want to do fiction because it thrills me and I never know what it is. Just before we talk today, I'm, page 150 of the next novel. I'm just feeling my way and discovering it and seeing the sentences come together. I have no idea. Well, I have some idea, but I don't really know what it will be until it happens. And this is so exciting. Uh, this is why the excitement of art and why I only wanted to be an artist, and which I tried to communicate to my students. One of the joys at USC was having some of the incredibly brilliant and talented people from the film school casually take a creative writing course,
Mm,
and I could seduce them into creative writing. Because in the film school, of course, you're working in an industry and you have a set form of how to write your screenplay and what to do and so on. With me, it's complete freedom. There are no rules. You do whatever motivates you. And here it is. And we'll give you an impression of it, an interpretation, period. That's it, as far as it goes. That freedom is what I've lived with all my life.
I mean, do you know or can you define in any way what it is that triggers that need to make a story out of something? When something goes from being just a series of incidents to a story?
I think it's just the desire that our species has for communication. We think something, see something, make something, and we want to show it to other people because we want feedback, we want communication, we want them to think and feel and show us something too. I think that's the essence of it. And there's also the question of the preposterous universe we live in that has no reason, whereas we are a species that knows reason and knows science and wants reason. There is no reason for anything. And art is a way of addressing that void, the only way of addressing that void. And again, I wish my talent had lain in music more than in literature, because music is the purest art. It is pure opening of the soul and the unconscious. 99% of what you're doing when you're playing is purely opening your soul. And I would say with writing, it's more like 10%, okay? Is in control. No, maybe 90% is opening your soul. 10% is controlling. With music, maybe 1% is controlling. You don't even know what you're doing. And you're a writer, when you're in the throes of composition, you're out of the world, and that's an important thing. My last book, Outside Looking In, which is regarding human consciousness and its manipulation by LSD and other drugs and so on. Well, what is human consciousness? It's a burden. It's an incredible burden to us, which is why we need stories and why we need each other and why we need drugs, alcohol, some way of getting out of our own selves. That's the burden that we live with. And the burden is compounded by the fact that we are the only conscious species that knows of our own death and the futility of everything in life. So art is a way of trying to assuage that or address it or wonder about it. And this is why I do it. I've never written any story or book thinking, wow, this will sell. I never thought about that. I never cared about that. I still
Hmm.
don't. I just think this is fascinating. I wonder what it means. And I never know. what anything means unless I make a story out of it.
I mean, you talked about teaching at USC. Uh, did you ultimately come to feel that this impulse to tell stories and this, I hesitate, I don't know, a gift or whatever, is that something that can be taught?
Um, the gift is pretty much universal. And the thing that amazed me about my students is how brilliant they are, how deep that gift goes. I'm just a coach to kind of nudge them and appraise them and appraise them, but this gift is universal. Um, you can't teach someone to be a great artist unless they have the genetic makeup and the gift to be a great artist. But you can make them comfortable and demonstrate to them that artists exist and can continue to exist, and that you too can be an artist, which is how I got going. And so you need a mentor, and you need some interpretation of what you're doing, and some encouragement of what you're doing.
Did do you feel like, are you the kind of person who feels like um, that the perseverance of writing every day and really driving yourself to sit there a certain amount of time is what creates, what brings the creativity? Or do you feel that you really need to wait for the mood to write something?
I have to work all the time. I work 7 days a week all my life. That's what I do. That's my life. I need that. I need that as a structure in my life. But all books of advice from writers are completely useless, or how to write or anything else, because all that matters is how you address it yourself. You could have inspiration. You could be a writer who has inspiration for 10 minutes every night at midnight and write great stuff. You could be a writer who writes on the subway. You could be a writer who writes upside down underwater. It doesn't really matter. I just find something that you're comfortable with. For me, yeah, particularly with a novel, it's good to stay with it every day because of the enormous amount of touring I've had to do over the years. Wait, by the way, which is over now, because not only because of the pandemic, but I don't think there'll be much touring anymore because we have this forum and other forums. Um, and people don't even attend concerts or anything anymore. Maybe they will once this is over. I don't know. But anyway, all of that is a kind of sidelight to what I'm doing, and it does interfere with it, so that no novel since Ribbon Rock, which is late '90s, that I've written has been written continuously through in a block of a full year, or in that case, 14 months, without having to go off for a month on tour somewhere from the previous book. It just worked out that way. So
Mm.
I'm used to being interrupted at some point with each book because of touring. Curiously, because of the pandemic, the one that I'm just writing now, called Blue Skies, which is maybe a third to a half done, uh, it may be that I will be able to write this without having to do any touring. So far, my Have Talk to Me is coming out in the fall from Echo at HarperCollins, and so far they're not booking any live engagements because they're hedging their bets. I bet,
Mm.
and I think that we will be back to public performance in the fall. But in this case, I certainly won't have to make a tour.
How do you feel about the idea of stories that are found versus stories that you sort of create from your imagination? I mean, uh, I know some writers feel like they want to have the whole story handed to them and they just want to make it beautiful. But how do you feel about that? Do you have any sense of that? I know,
It's a
for
great way to
example,
do
with
it, and it's an
what's
easy way.
that?
It's a great way to do it, and it's an easy way to do it. I think the stories that have come to me most easily are ones in which I don't have to research anything or think about it. I just have an experience and I write about it. But I'm not an autobiographical writer for the most part. There are certain stories like Greasy Lake or Up Against the Wall and stories like that that are obviously coming from my own experience, although they are stories and they are shaped as stories, and incidents in them didn't necessarily happen like that. But those are the stories that are the most comfortable and easiest to write. On the other hand, I write every kind of story, and I love stories in this sort of magical realist mode, a kind of Garcia Marquesian, Calvino sort of mode. I just love that voice of the folk tale, you know, I just love them. So you'll always see stories like that in my collections, like the 5 Pound Burrito, for instance, or Swept Away, and these stories. I love them also. They come to me quite easily. With the novels, most of them involve some research as a subject in order to get me thinking about this particular subject. So, for instance, Talk to Me is something that has impressed me for many years and fascinated me. This is a novel about the experiments to teach apes our language in the 70s and 80s. I know other people have done this and been there, but I don't really care. My first book of stories is called Descent of Men, and the first story comes from when I was a student in the 70s. I discovered that we were having these experiments. And so I wrote a really madcap, surreal story about a female researcher, a brilliant young ape, and her boyfriend. Uh, and this novel takes that kind of love triangle, but in a much less bizarre way, and dramatizes it. And I do believe that this one, in its climax, will tear your heart out.
I'm sure.
You be forewarned. And also in
um,
this one, David, for the experiment of it, uh, alternate chapters are written from the point of view of the ape himself, which was a lot of fun. Oh, it was fun to do that.
okay. I mean, I wonder also, as someone who's become a public figure, um, you've become the subject of this interview. You sort of become the subject of other people's stories. How do you feel about that experience? Has it changed your own view about stories?
I don't know about it so much because anything I don't want to know about, I just shut the door. I don't know. I don't look myself up on the internet and see what people are saying. I don't really care. And in the beginning, I would read the reviews. Now I don't read the reviews because they upset me, whether even good or bad, they upset me. So aside from, if someone will say, my publisher will say, hey, this review is really great, maybe I would read that and feel, gee, I'm doing something good. But really, I don't want to know. I really don't want to know about that at all. I don't want it to influence me in any way. And also when a book comes out and, reviews are good and they're selecting quotes of how brilliant you are and wonderful and so on, it makes you think, well, shit, maybe I should do that again. And meanwhile, you're 2/3 into the next one, so it's all kind of confusing. Um, I think when I was younger, of course, I cared more about all of that, public image and projecting my charisma on the crowds and doing all the interviews and so on. Now, I've been there, done that, and I love to do press. I love to talk about my books. The best reviews and interviews are ones in which we're talking as we are talking now. Uh, the best review isn't necessarily this guy's a genius, this is the greatest book, run out and buy it. That's good. But ones that dig in interpretively to what you're doing, because that is a kind of dialogue between you and the critic. To see what you've done. You don't even know what you've done to a degree. I mean, I could write a thesis on my own story, but other people have other feelings and see other values in it. So that process of reviewing and interviewing is quite stimulating and quite good. But otherwise, being a public figure and whatever is being said about me, I don't want to know.
I mean, one thing you brought up before was the superheroes and the fact that you were turned off by the superhero movies. But clearly, your books do have heroes or certainly central figures. Do you think that
I wrote a book called The Human Fly about a superhero, but he's not really a superhero. He's a wannabe. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
so do you think that do books need heroes?
That's a great question. Don't forget, one of my collections is called Without a Hero. Um, I like stories that have heroes, and I like stories in which everything turns out well in the end. Unfortunately, I don't write very many of them. I'm much more interested in real people who are fucked up in various ways. And also, of course, in the larger questions of evolution and ontology and just what we're doing here on this planet as animals on this planet and biological issues. I write more and more about this, and ecological issues is what absorbs me and then the characters, of course, play against that, as we all do, as we have to play against being an animal in this world and being subject to all the ills of this world, uh, um, and worrying about it, worrying about what it means and where it's going. And, I'm sure that every generation, as they age, they have these feelings of uselessness and so on. But in our time, it's even worse because not only do we have to face our personal extinction, we're looking at the extinction of our species. That's what's going to happen. That's happening, I think. I don't think it's going to be that far in the future. Uh, for instance, one of the things that motivated my new book, which is called Blue Skies, is by reading about the German um, entomological societies, amateur societies who go out and collect insects, and they discovered the startling decline in flying insects. And this is worldwide, insect populations worldwide of flying insects have plummeted. Well, what does this mean? Why is this? What about the food chain? What are we going to eat? All of this stuff is staggering to even think about. And so I have to try to make a story about it and make it funny, of course, but still try to figure out what it means.
I mean, another aspect of society today is, the almost hyperactive sharing of stories. We're all constantly putting out these stories to each other. I mean, on social media, whether it's an article you share or something about yourself, you know, it always reminds me of that Norman Mailer book called Advertisements for Myself. Um, what do you think that this is sort of doing to the society, through the stories that we sort of selectively tell each other um, in an almost, 24/7 way?
To a degree, I think it's good for people because they're exerting their individuality and saying, look, I'm important, I'm alive, here I am, this is what I like. I think that's fine. It's different from making art, though, which requires talent and an investment of time and the spark of ideas and so on and so on. Until 5 years ago, when I switched publishers to Echo, I had never participated in any social media aside from my own webpage, which my son created when he was in high school. So it's been going since 1999. And by the way, before the social media came along, it was a big deal. You want to talk about literature, they would come to my site. Now it's been superseded by all the rest of this, Facebook and so on. So they gave me a Twitter account, and I love Twitter, and I'm active on it, but only in my own fan base, only with my own fan base. And I can control that, as I might control a classroom, for instance. I'm not interested in going into the main public arena and say, fuck you, and back and forth. And who needs that? I don't need that. So mine is a very benign and amusing presence. Uh, uh, I always, from the beginning, would take a photo and make a comment. And this is my day, and this is what I'm doing, and this is what I'm thinking, and this is what I'm reading, and so on. And it's very whimsical and amusing. Uh, and it does engage me. It engages me. But I have a regular time to do all of this. So my fans know that before I get to work in the morning, I will dedicate some time to responding to them. And then they're going to have a long drive until the next day. But meanwhile, wherever I'm going, whatever I'm doing that motivates me, I will photograph something and make a comment. And what's great about it for me is I'm a nature boy. I'm outside all the time and I'm seeing things. And it enables me to capture little moments that we see and enjoy and walk right by. And so often the fans will then tweet me back their little photos that they've taken of nature and so on, and
Hmm.
books and music, and they turn me on, I turn them on. It's a lot of fun. It's good. Um, There are a lot of hours in the day. I don't mind giving up some time to do this, but it's not an obsession. And I certainly won't check it or look at it until tomorrow morning, because in order to produce 30 books, and I'm working on the 31st now, it's pedal to the metal. It's got to be your obsession. And I don't want anything to interfere with that.
So, looking at your own, you've had this incredibly prolific career. You've written about so many different things. Do you see any kind of an arc in the story of your own writing, and where that's going to go, where you want that to go? Or you're
Mhm.
just taking it one book at a time, and that's
We talked
that's all
about
you want to do?
it earlier in this conversation. Uh, I write in many modes. I don't want to be pinned down. Uh, I think that I can write about any subject or anything that interests me in any mode. And that is very stimulating creatively. So that has helped me have this career and keep myself interested. Uh, More and more, though, again, as we said earlier, I see myself as writing about our place as animals on this planet in an ecological way, and trying to get at, the great questions of human life in a more biological, ecological way, because that's what fascinates me. If it weren't for math, I might have been perfectly happy to be a field biologist, for instance. I'm fascinated by the outdoors, by creatures, but that was not to be. Uh, Still, I see that interest emerging in my books, and um, I'm way ahead of the loop. Everybody says, "Oh, well, Friend of the Earth was the year 2000. It's about global warming, a pandemic, extinction, species loss, etc." Yeah, well, I've been keeping my eyes open, and now I'm trying to project that projected to 2026 from 2000. Now I'm hoping, I don't know if it will happen in this book, to project again into the future to see what might lie ahead.
Well, it's been really great talking to you, Tom. I really appreciate your time today and your insight.
Good,
Really-
David. We haven't had a drink together in many years. Let's do that next time I'm in New York. If I am, we'll see. I don't think on this tour that there will be any live movement, but we'll see. It's the end of September, and we'll see. If I am, we definitely must get
Okay,
together.
that sounds great. All right, Tom, take it easy.
So have fun, David. Thank you.
Okay, talk to you soon.
The Story Talks Back is produced and hosted by Dave Stanton. The music you're hearing now was written and performed by Christopher Daydream. The theme music at the beginning of our show is an excerpt from Play by Merlin Twelfhoven, performed by Kronos Quartet as part of their 50 for the Future series. Please subscribe to The Story Talks Back on Podbean and check us out on Instagram. See you next time.